There are growing calls for more regulation of foreign-owned spaza shops in the country. This has been reignited by the spate of children losing their lives after eating snacks sold at these shops. In the wake of the deaths, some communities have called for the closure of all foreign-owned spaza shops and tighter enforcement of immigration regulations. To discuss this, I'm joined by Dr. Dale McKinley, who is a research and education officer at the International Labour Research and Information Group. A very good afternoon to you, Dale. Thanks very much for your time. I mean, we've seen some looting, accompanied, of course, unfortunately, by violence as well, concerning, I think, to everybody.
Good afternoon, Vuyo. Yes, I think it is of deep concern. I mean, obviously, this is the latest in a fairly long string of incidences that go back many years in relation to targeting of, in this case now, of foreign-owned spaza shops. And I think the first thing to say is that, to call for calm, to call for a rational sort of approach to this, which I know is difficult in the circumstances given, particularly when people lose their lives. But as has happened with Naledi, when the children that passed away in Naledi and some of the investigations that were done, as even the authorities say, there's always not necessarily the connection between what is sold at the spaza shops and the deaths. There's a complex potential sort of explanations as to why this might be the case, where they picked up these kinds of things that would have caused that kind of death and caused the reactions for people to get very sick. We've seen this with school children in other areas of the country. We've seen it around. So it's not to jump to conclusions and to then scapegoat and blame all foreign-owned spaza shops and then let's close them down or let's do that, but to do a proper investigation as to where these things come from. What is the source of is it, some you see on social media, you've seen in the context of the health department talking about, unhygienic conditions that exist, but we've also seen the listeriosis crisis where Premier Foods, Tiger Brands, a big corporate, 80-something people died in that context with, mishandling of food. So it's a general problem that we have. It's not specific to spaza shops. It's a general problem about food hygiene and food safety, and that is the role of the state and the departments of health at provincial and national level, and I think that's where we need to start.
And that's exactly where I was going, Dale, because as you say, it is a complex matter, but one doesn't think that it's unfair to put or to say the state has to, at all levels, has to carry a degree of blame, because the mere fact that you have a state, it is to actually take care, of these sorts of things proactively. And that's not to say nothing will happen. There won't be unscrupulous people out there. There won't be people who defy the law and who try to get around it. But that's where it's supposed to begin, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And, we have, I think when it comes to our regulations, this is the same in the labor sphere, where we have seen over the past, police and sometimes Labor Department finding almost slave-like conditions within some factories or houses where people are being humanly trafficked and held against their will. We've seen this with regards to a whole range of different state-owned public services where the regulation is very, very weak. So the question is, what are our state authorities doing? Why are they not actually enforcing the very laws that we have in this country? We have food safety laws, we have hygiene laws, we have bylaws at the municipal and other levels. The question is, are they being enforced? And the unfortunate answer is mostly not. And so, as you say, it's not about whether or not you're from this country or that country, or whether you're this color or that color, or whether you speak this language or that language. There's always going to be people that are going to take advantage. But the majority of people, I think, if they were put in a situation where they were regulated properly, where there was regular visits and site visits by an inspectorate that is capacitated and given the necessary budget, then these problems would virtually cease to exist, or at least there would be much, much less. So yes, the fundamental problem is that we have a system, much like our immigration system, in which the authorities that are responsible for its own regulation and its own enforcement are generally seem to be asleep at the wheel.
Of course, I mean, there's also, excuse me, I mean, beyond capacity issues and enforcing the laws, as you say, whether these are bylaws, municipal bylaws, or whether these are hygiene laws, whatever checks and balances are there. But there's also the question of will. And I think the Listeriosis and Tiger Brands case is a case in point, because here you now have your NGOs, community-based organizations, activists, lawyers trying to, get behind these families, trying to support them, getting what is best for them. And you have a state that is just sitting there and hardly saying anything, let alone doing something.
Yeah, and let's just expand this in terms of, for example, there's the silicosis and the asbestosis cases, these class action suits that are representing tens of thousands of ex-miners who have contracted these diseases as a result of their work in the mines. And yet, what do we see? We see 5, 7, 10, 15 years on, very little action, very little people getting their funds. One could say the same for the 80 billion rand in unpaid pensions to ex-workers and their dependents. So it's a failure of our public sector and our state to basically do what they're supposed to be doing, which is not only to enforce the law, but to make sure that people who have been exploited, who have suffered these kinds of diseases, who have been on the receiving end of malpractices and other kinds of things and lack of food hygiene, to get justice. That's what we have a justice system for. That's what we have a government for. So in this case, yes, you can, if you find people that are breaking the law, well, then arrest them. It doesn't matter what nationality they are. It doesn't matter where they come from, and let the law take its course. But as we've seen with the state capture cases, to get to that point seems to be taking forever, because our authorities are simply seemingly not willing, as you say, they don't seem to have the will to act. They talk a lot, they issue a lot of press statements, they promise a lot, but the action is very thin.
And that's not to say, of course, I mean, businesses big and small, whether you're a Tiger Brands or a spaza shop in a corner of the street in some township or village somewhere, people should be expected to, account for their actions and face, the consequences of their, whether it's unscrupulous behavior or whether it's just failures.
Absolutely, and we can look at our own city right now and our water crisis, which causes a lot of health problems. When you have broken pipes, when you have water quality it's not very good, when you have a situation where people are trying to access water at any cost, you're going to have health issues. This is another example of where those that are responsible for these things are simply not being held to account. So one, you get the shift blaming. It's not our problem. It's Rand Water. It's City of Joburg. We don't have this. It's the weather, whatever it might be. But I think this is where South Africans are very frustrated, and understandably so. And where anger then boils over into what you mentioned right at the beginning, which is unfortunately sometimes violent behavior. But it's understandable that people are very, very upset, because what's happened is their public sector is failing them in almost every single realm. And the private sector oftentimes is not coming to the party either. They say, well, yes, the state's to blame. But as we mentioned with Tiger Brands, they're oftentimes culpable. So what we have is a crisis of accountability across the board. And now we're seeing it with the most vulnerable and most marginalized communities, where people who are simply buying a snack at a spaza shop are paying the price for that negligence.
Of course, I mean, we can whinge and moan all we want. At the end of the day, we have to find solutions to everything we've just spoken about. It's just from where you sit, are there levers we still haven't used as a people to really force, whether it's the authorities, the powers that be, or businesses, big and small, to actually get them to do the right things? Is there something we still haven't done, to get these people to do what we expect them to do?
Well, I think certainly there is. I mean, we go back a little bit to our past, where we had effective campaigns, for example, and this is not specific to our country, but generally speaking, when consumers are sold false goods or sold bad goods, and where you don't have those standards, then a classic case is to basically institute a strike or a boycott or a pressure on that particular service provider or that particular company in order to change their ways. And we haven't seen that oftentimes. So imagine, for example, in Soweto, if you boycotted Pick and Pay or you boycotted a particular brands and everything. There's been a strike at Mr. Sweet for the last 2 months over working conditions. Premier brand owns Mr. Sweet, and that yet hasn't really taken off. So I think if ordinary people can see that they do have consumer power, we're the ones that buy these goods. We're the ones that create the profit for those who are running these businesses. And our power, just like workers, when you withhold your labor in a strike, so too consumers do that. I think that is an area where we could definitely make much, much more impact. The second one, of course, which is the political realm. And we've seen, I think what we're beginning to see is the beginnings of a shift, a political shift, where those that have been dominant for so long and have taken the political space are losing that legitimacy and losing that hegemony. And people are not quite sure of where to turn or who to massively vote for, as we saw in the last elections. But I think what you're seeing is a civic mindedness and a sense of we are going to seek these alternatives. We are going to try to put in people who can do jobs, who are going to answer to us. And that's going to take a while because we're 30 years into a situation where we're so used to a political dominance that I think we're going to move out of that. But I think we can do much more in terms of creating those, not just complaining, not just sort of sending messages to our politicians, but creating the very conditions for new kinds of politicians to come up from those communities and to be accountable to those communities. That's what real democracy is about. We're a young democracy, but I think we're learning and we're getting to that point.
And that, I would imagine, Dr. McKinley, would be more powerful and effective than any violent or xenophobic action. Thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it. Dr. Dale McKinley, Research and Education Officer at the International Labour Research and Information Group.